Picture a man brilliant, wealthy, fearless, who built empires with his mind producing Hollywood blockbusters, pushing the limits of aviation, bending business, technology, and glamour to his will. But what begins with jets, soaring through open skies and silver screens, ends in a darkness of solitude, obsession, and paranoia. Let's delve into the twilight world of Howard Hughes, here on Things Visible and Invisible. Geoff Schumacher is a veteran American journalist turned historian and museum executive. He spent 25 years in newspapers, writing, editing, and publishing. Of his many books, he is the author of Howard Hughes, Power, Paranoia, and Palace Intrigue. And he joins me down the line from where else but Las Vegas. Geoff, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome to Things Visible and Invisible. Geoff, when it comes to Howard Hughes, there's two things on my mind. First of all, is there anything new to say about this man? And secondly, why the continuing fascination?
You know, it's interesting. He was one of the most famous people of the 20th century. And there's no question that, he was on the front pages of newspapers really from the 1920s through the 1980s in a continuous way. It's amazing to me that here we are in the 21st century and people are still interested in him and still fascinated by the secrets, and the sort of strange life that he lived. So there's something enduring about these characters that just are so multifaceted, I think.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to get into that, but I've got some bad news for you, Geoff. Believe it or not, there are some people who have never heard of Howard Hughes, won't know what we're talking about. So we're going to have to go right the way back to the start, which is probably a good place to start because a lot of us know of Howard Hughes, but very few of us know about his origin story. So tell me, where does he hail from? Where does he come from? What was his family?
Yeah, so he was born into wealth. His father, Howard Hughes Sr., was involved in the oil business, and this was around the turn of the 20th century. And he, with another man, developed a rotary drill bit. So this was a bit it was a way to drill oil wells that was much more effective, much more efficient than how they had been doing it. And so he started a company, Hughes Tool Company, and he started selling these drill bits, actually leasing the drill bits so that, there was an endless supply of income. And he soon became a millionaire. He was incredibly wealthy from this invention. And so when Howard Hughes was born in 1905, his dad was on the verge of becoming very wealthy. So that's really the foundation of the fortune. And then Howard grew up in Texas, the center of the oil industry, but he had a very famous uncle Rupert, who lived in Hollywood, and was he was a novelist and a Hollywood screenwriter and a director, and so he had an early exposure to Hollywood as well.
And what do we know about the young Howard Hughes? I mean, some people, when you read biographies, you often think that the germ of the adult is sometimes in the child. I mean, was he a very sort of precocious child? Was he a very intelligent child? Or was he a loner? Was he very gregarious? What sort of child was he growing up?
Yeah, the impression you get from, studying Howard Hughes's youth is that he was incredibly bright. That everybody sort of knew that, and he was, wanted to almost be an inventor like his father had been. He came up with all kinds of interesting schemes. He went to advanced schools, and he had great promise. He also, though, was very eccentric, and this probably comes a lot from his mother. Probably his germ phobia really started with his mother and the way she treated him and protected him from the world, or tried to, and so some of his eccentricities that came to light in a big way later in his life were reportedly evident in him as a child as well.
Okay. So did he go through formal education, or was he so wealthy that he was privately educated?
So he went to private schools, and then but he didn't really do much with college. He was there for a brief time, but because of it, his father, first of all, his mother died, and then his father died when he was very young. He was still a teenager, and he was faced with the prospect of taking over the family business. And there were people within the family who thought, oh, an 18-year-old, he's too young to take over this giant company. Howard thought otherwise, and he was determined to take it over. He actually persuaded a judge to give him. He wasn't 21 yet, and he was persuaded the judge to give him the company. And this was over the objections of other family members. So at a very young age, he jumped right into the business world.
I'm not sure whether that is a good thing or a bad thing, Geoff. It sounds like a recipe for disaster. A, to have that much responsibility, but also to have that amount of, or access to that amount of money. Was that the case with the young Howard?
I think what's interesting about him is he didn't fail when it came to the Hughes Tool Company. In other words, he had good people who ran it, and then he was like the sort of the CEO from afar because he wasn't really interested in oil drilling. Keep in mind this is the 1920s now. What's the biggest thing in the world in the 1920s? Movies. People are going to the movies like there's no tomorrow, and you want to get involved in that. And his uncle was already involved, and so Howard wanted to use this wealth, wanted to use his influence in a different way. So before long, he had placed the tool company in the hands of other people to run, and then he went to Hollywood to start making movies, and he started making them in the late 20s. He was already making silent films.
I mean, in some ways, the trajectory that you've painted, Geoff, is not inconsistent with his family background. I mean, his father saw an opportunity and made a lot of money from it because it was very much of its moment. And the young Howard has an eye for the same thing. He recognizes the power of cinema and the money that can be made from it, and heads out west to Los Angeles. Was that it? Do you think it was a business decision in a way, or do you think it was the bright lights and all the glamour that was associated with it, or perhaps a bit of both?
I think the answer is a bit of both. He immediately upon his arrival in Hollywood, he's a young man. He's got a lot of money. He's got a lot of clout already because he's making movies. And so he is dating, Hollywood stars before you know it, and he's very much involved in the sort of glamour of Hollywood. At the same time, I think he fancies himself to be a creative force. I'm not sure the record plays that out. In other words, I'm not sure he was a great director or a great screenwriter or anything like that. But he aspired to that. And to the point where, and he was also kind of a control freak. So, when, it was hard for him to sort of just let somebody else make the movies, he felt inclined to dabble. And this really came to the fore with the movie Hell's Angels, which is World War I flying epic. And he ended up, directing the film. And while if you watch the movie today, the dialogue is not good. Some of the acting is not good, but what he excelled at was pushing the special effects, right? The flying aces battling back and forth in the air, and how that was filmed is still amazing to this day. The footage that he obtained for that movie was beyond what perhaps the average director would have expected at the time. We're talking about 1929, 1930, when the idea of filming in the air and filming planes flying at each other and shooting at each other was probably not common practice.
I mean, I'm wondering as you're speaking, Geoff. I mean, he's still a very young man. Were there any sort of checks and balances? Were there any sort of wise heads in his world that were advising him, that were maybe cautioning him, or was this just a young man, sort of like a kid in a sweet shop? I mean, he could have whatever he wanted, and he was just going to do whatever he wanted.
I think it's a little of both again. He did have wise advisors. He was smart enough to have people in charge of his operations who, it's not so much that they would tell him no, like they didn't have veto power over what he was doing, but they could advise him in a wise way to say, hey, this person might be taking advantage of you, or be wary of this situation, or what have you. My last time this happened, this is how it went down, so you should be more careful. So there was a combination of those wise heads alongside his just absolute ambition. Before long, he was certainly, we talked about movies, but then he got involved with aviation, which was the other big development in that era. I mean, people were absolutely amazed by what airplanes could do and what the potential was. And so Howard recognized that right away as well.
I mean, he knew how to pick a glamorous industry to get involved in. I mean, was this something that was? I mean, I'm wondering, was he a glamorous figure, or was he a glamorous figure by the fact that he was involved with the glamorous industries of aviation and motion pictures?
I want to give him his due. I want to give him his credit because especially in the aviation world, he wasn't just like hiring engineers and pilots and then trying to set speed records by having them fly the planes. I mean, he flew the planes, and he was not a trained engineer, but he learned alongside these individuals he did hire, and he learned as much about aviation and how planes are built as anybody. He was all the engineers who worked with him, they never looked down upon him. They understood that he knew how a plane should fly because he was up there in the pilot's seat testing these airplanes. Now, of course, he crashed a few times. That was a problem later on. But for the most part, here's a guy who is much like, if you're in war, and you're a general. The troops are going to respect you more if you're in the mix with them. You're not standing back on the hill watching, but in fact, you're up there with them engaging the enemy. That's very much how Howard Hughes was when it came both to filmmaking and to flying. He was right in the mix.
Now, what was the sort of wider reaction to Howard Hughes? I'm talking about in the press, in the media, in Hollywood. I mean, did people see him as a bit of a spoilt brat who could do whatever he wanted, or were they sort of impressed by his entrepreneurial output in various ways?
I think in Hollywood, he was a little bit more of an outsider than he was in the aviation field. So like in Hollywood, you had these big names developing, these big production companies developing, and Howard was on the outside of that. He had the money. He was kind of this brash, young, daring guy who was going to go his own way. But when it came to aviation, everybody was kind of new to it at that point, and he was kind of an equal partner or an equal more with the other fellas who were trying to build the faster, better airplane. When he flew around the world in record time in 1938, I mean, he set the record. He blew the record away, and he was world famous. He wasn't just famous in America. He was famous everywhere. And he did something that nobody else had ever done before. It was the equivalent of climbing Mount Everest or something. It was a big deal, and he did it. He didn't just have someone else do it as his proxy.
Just remind us how old he was when he flew around the world.
Well, let's see. He was born in 1905, and he flew around the world in record time in 1938. So I mean, he was still a young man at that point.
Absolutely.
And he was through the arc of his life, when the biggest stuff happened, he was still young.
Talk to me a little bit about the psychology of Howard Hughes, and we're gonna look at the plus and the minus on this score, Geoff. But I mean, was he a very driven person? Did he want to succeed, or was he somebody who there was an element of the show off about him that he wanted? He was a bit of a showman. What do your researches tell us about the psychology of Howard Hughes at this point in his life?
So he's extremely driven, and what's interesting about him is he was not driven by money. In other words, he had money. That was not the object. The object was, in the case of aviation, he just wanted to build a better airplane. He wanted to build something that no one else had ever built before, faster, bigger, and so forth. And so he was actually a problem because he was so driven that he could conceivably work, 18 or 20 or 24 hours straight on a project, and he would expect others to do the same, right? So everybody else should be going home, to have dinner with the wife and the kids, and he's expecting them to stay at the plant and keep working with him on the airplane design, keep, going over things again and again and again. He was more than a bit of an obsessive compulsive personality, and this was reflected in how he would go about working as well. So even though, this proved to people, hey, I'm serious about this, and I want to learn and I want to contribute, but it also could be detrimental to other people because he was the boss, and if you wanted to stay with the project, you had to do what he wanted to do.
Well, just on that, Geoff, he's a young man in his 30s, but a lot of people by that time, by that age, had settled down or started a family or something like that. What was the status of Howard Hughes' private life?
So early on, Hughes had married. It did not go well. He was spending a lot of time at Hollywood parties, and his wife was not as interested in that. And she didn't fit in that well in the Hollywood culture, and so they divorced. And then he had a series of girlfriends. Probably the most serious of whom was Katharine Hepburn, the actress Katharine Hepburn. This is depicted to pretty good effect, I think, in the movie The Aviator. And he and she were quite serious for a time, but what's interesting about her is she was as ambitious as he was. She was as driven as he was. And so they were almost like, happily separated much of the time because she was out making movies. He was, involved in building airplanes and making movies and doing everything else that he did. And so they would come together once in a while. So he was generally a single man, and he dated practically every Hollywood starlet there was from the late 20s through the 40s. So I think World War II was a difficult time for him, and the reason is that he was not able to accomplish what he wanted to accomplish during the war. He wanted to become a major supplier of airplanes to the U.S. military to help win the war. And even though he had a lot of money, he did not really have the infrastructure in place to compete with the big companies that could really produce for the war effort. And I think the United States government too was a little skeptical of whether Howard could produce. So he conceived of the idea of the flying boat. This was an airplane that would carry troops across overseas in a very efficient way. There was a lot of warfare on the seas, and so if you wanted to transport thousands of troops from, let's say, the United States to Europe, there was a good chance that the Nazis might shoot you out of the water. So whether from a submarine or from a plane. So the idea was to create a flying boat that would transport thousands of troops, across the ocean efficiently. So Hughes got a relatively small contract to design and build this plane. And one of the things they said is, well, we have a problem. We don't have enough metal that we can allow you to build this thing out of metal. We need the metal for other things, so you need to build it out of wood. So he literally had to build this giant airplane out of wood. It's not like I'm talking about 2x4s now, but I mean, it was definitely a novel concept to build a military craft out of wood, but he was determined to do it. Unfortunately, he was not able to complete the project by the end of the war. So, he was not really able to contribute to the war effort in this way.
So talk to me about post-war years with Howard Hughes. He's starting to age a little bit. Do you know what I mean? Maybe the shine is going off him. I mean, did he suffer from any kind of midlife crisis as to what the purpose of his life was?
Well, I think a couple of things happened that were a little more practical that affected his life. One was in 1943, he was testing an aircraft at Lake Mead outside of Las Vegas, and it was a plane that would land on the water and then take off again. And he tested this dozens and dozens of times. He would fly, land on the water, take off again. It was going very well. So he wanted to show this off to some people who were involved in the aviation industry. So he invited them out to the lake. He brought them on the plane. He lands the plane on the water, and one of the wings dips into the water. The plane starts swirling around, and it basically crashes and sinks. Well, one man died. Hughes and another guy were able to get out. Another guy later died. And it was pretty serious accident, and the fact that people had died in the accident definitely affected Hughes. His own injuries were significant, but he survived. And then a couple of years later, he was testing another aircraft, and he crashed very severely into the Los Angeles Country Club, and hit a house. And then the airplane was in flames, and a Marine off duty raced to the plane, ran in, grabbed Hughes literally out of the cockpit, and pulled him away from the wreckage and from the flames, saved his life. And Hughes in that particular crash was very severely injured. He was in the hospital with broken bones, with severe third-degree burns, things like that. And he should have stayed in the hospital for much longer than he did. He ended up getting out or walking out after 6 weeks, and he basically started taking morphine in pretty high doses right after that. And because he really should have spent more time recovering, but he's Howard Hughes, right? He can't sit in a hospital. So he got himself out of there and really gained a drug addiction out of it. And there were obviously other psychological effects as well.
I mean, some have speculated, sort of armchair psychologists have speculated that this is the moment where the ascent of Howard Hughes literally comes down in a crash, but also his whole world starts to unravel in a sense at this point. Do you hold to that thesis, Geoff?
I think I think there's a validity to that. I think that particular crash, he probably wouldn't have said that was the case. In other words, if you would have asked him, he would have said, "Oh, no, it's fine." It's kind of the way he would look at it. But I think there's no question that his the physical damage that occurred at that time slowed him down, and the psychological damage, it really accelerated his obsessive compulsiveness, his germ phobia, other things that ultimately turned him into a recluse. He still had some good years after that. We want to be fair that in 1947, he had this triumphant testimony in Washington, where he testified before Congress. They were questioning whether he had been a war profiteer by taking money for the flying boat, which popularly known as the Spruce Goose, if that isn't familiar to everyone. And people accused him of, well, you didn't finish this plane. Maybe you never intended to finish it. Maybe it was not a good design. Why did you take $17 million from the U.S. government and so forth? He, very eloquently got in front of Congress and testified, and and really pointed out the hypocrisy of the men who were questioning him, the fact that they really were more interested in other political aims than the flying boat. They were in cahoots with basically with Pan American Airlines, which was his competitor with TWA, and so he was able to point these things out in the testimony and walk out of there, having basically won the day. He also at that time promised that that flying boat would fly. He made a vow that if it didn't fly, that he would leave the country. So he set to work right after that, preparing to get that flying boat into the air. He took it out in Long Beach Harbor one day. He didn't tell anybody who was there. He did. They were going to just motor around the water in the bay, and he revved it up to 80 or 90 miles an hour, and it lifted off and flew for I think about a minute before it came back down to the water. And it was an amazing for him achievement because he proved that this thing would fly. By the way, that's the only time it ever flew, and it basically went into mothballs immediately after. So, but the point is that he still had a little bit left at that point. And then he bought RKO Pictures and wanted to get back into the movie business.
And how successful was that?
So not great. He some people would say that he wrecked RKO Studios. That with his kind of his taste or lack thereof, or his budgeting or lack thereof, that he made a lot of very bad movies, and never made a great movie when he was the owner. So I think that didn't go as well as it could have. He might have argued that at that point it was probably impractical for him to direct the movies, the way he had done in an earlier part of his life. And so I'm sure he might have been arrogant enough to say, well, if I had been able to direct these movies, they'd be better. But, not a great episode for him with RKO.
Now, you alluded to it earlier, Geoff, this sort of onset of his becoming a recluse and the various phobias that were to possess him. I mean, were these becoming evident to people around him in these years?
I think so. I think people who were close to him from the late 40s till his death, of course, in the late 70s, that I think it was increasingly evident that here was a guy who had a lot of issues, a lot of mental issues that at the time they probably were characterized as eccentricities, and he was not receiving any kind of mental health care that he should have. This is still in the early years of that. It's not like everybody was going to a psychiatrist at that time. In fact, very few people were, and so he didn't receive the care that he should have. He was kind of on his own. And the fact that he was so rich and powerful made it difficult for people to stand up to him too, and kind of say, "Hey, Howard, you need to change your ways."
So, what year would you posit, Geoff, when we start to see the real decline of Howard Hughes, when we start to see him withdraw from public life and the phobias to take over?
I think the decline, he became a recluse in the late 1950s. So, really about 57, 58. There really are no pictures of Howard Hughes, actual pictures of Howard Hughes after, I believe, 1954 or 1955. And that's because he had really removed himself from the limelight, removed himself from public life. He was still talking to people regularly on the telephone. He was still, communicating back and forth with memos and letters, documents, but he was not interacting with people directly, except for this small group of personal aides, sort of hand selected, who he did interact with on a daily basis. But beyond those, that handful of guys, there was really nobody he was directly talking to.
And what sort of world was he inhabiting? Are we talking somebody who is really just in the grip of some sort of mental health episode for a prolonged period?
I think people would, if someone were to talk to Howard Hughes on the telephone, they would not detect that. They would not detect this his issues because he could, you know, in modern parlance, he could fake it. You know, he could disguise the problems that he was having by, you know, just being a businessman and having conversations about things that he was comfortable talking about, whether it was, you know, airplanes or Las Vegas casinos or whatever it is he was interested in at that time. But then behind the scenes, that's what we learned later is what was happening behind the scenes, where, you know, he was, you know, extremely strange behavior, also some physical ailments, right? I mean, things that, you know, we don't need to go into the details, but I mean, he would spend excessive amounts of time in the bathroom. You know, he would not shower and clean himself. He would not take care of himself, would not be dressed for long periods of time, let his hair grow very long, his fingernails grow long without proper care. And you wouldn't know that by talking to him on the phone.
No. And at what point does he become the kind of curiosity for tabloid journalism? Certainly it came this side of the Atlantic in the early 70s. At what point does he move from a sort of reclusive figure to this sort of almost like a sideshow attraction?
So when he moves to Las Vegas in 1966, he moves here secretly. He travels here by train on a specially set up train visit. That is, he's not on the train with anyone else, just himself and the driver. And he ends up in Las Vegas. Nobody knows he's here. Not nobody. Very few people know he's here. And he moves into the ninth floor of the Desert Inn Hotel. He basically takes over the entire ninth floor, which is the penthouse floor at that time. And he moves into one room of that penthouse floor, and his aides kind of occupy the rest of the floor. And he doesn't allow anybody up. And the guys who are on that floor are basically sworn to secrecy. They just take care of his daily needs. And this is where the rumors start. When people start realizing, okay, Howard Hughes has moved to Las Vegas. Where is he? You know, what's he doing? What's it all about? Both locally and nationally, I guess internationally, reporters are starting to pry. They're trying to find out what he's going to do. Pretty soon, he starts investing in Las Vegas real estate, in mining claims out throughout Nevada, and golf courses. He buys a television station. He's sort of just randomly buying Nevada, you know. And there's this notion that he wants to be a big fish in a little pond, and Hollywood and LA are just a little too big for him, but he's big enough to control an entire state. And in many ways, that's exactly what happened. He started buying casinos here, the first one being the Desert Inn, because he didn't want to move out of the penthouse suite. And he starts buying casinos. And at the time, and to this day, if you want to get a gaming license to run a casino in Nevada, you have to make a personal appearance before the Nevada Gaming Commission. Hughes was exempted from that requirement by the governor of Nevada at the time, Paul Laxalt, because Hughes, they wanted the investment from Hughes in the state, but there's no way Hughes was going to get cleaned up, get dressed, go to little Carson City, the capital of Nevada, and stand before the gaming commission, you know, and testify. He just wasn't going to do it. By that time, he was so reclusive and so eccentric and had so many issues that he couldn't. So the governor excluded him from having to do that.
Now, it's well documented, Geoff, and I think you know this better than anyone, that the mob were involved in the early days of Las Vegas and so on. How did Howard Hughes and the mob get on at this point in Las Vegas history?
So Hughes's interest in Las Vegas really dates to the 1940s. He spent a lot of time in Las Vegas. It was a place where he could avoid the limelight of Hollywood, New York, or any place where, you know, reporters would always be interested in him and his girlfriends. So he would come to Las Vegas where he could kind of be out of the limelight. And one of the things he did in the 1940s was he invested in the Flamingo Hotel. He was one of the early investors in the Flamingo, which, as most people know, was a mob place. And he his involvement with it wasn't that he was in cahoots with the mob, but he had a relationship with the man who originally conceived of the Flamingo, Billy Wilkerson, who was a prominent figure in Los Angeles at the time. Wilkerson ended up running out of money, though, and that's when the mob stepped in, and that's the famous Bugsy Siegel story. Well, Hughes always was aware of the mob. He was interacting with them through intermediaries in the 60s when he was buying these casinos. He had rubbed shoulders with these fellas at nightclubs in Los Angeles in the back in the day, but he was not in the mob. He was not beholden to the mob, as far as I can tell. He, in fact, bought out the mob when he bought 6 casinos in Las Vegas. Each of them had mob connections until he bought them. Now, the question is that still lingers to this day in Las Vegas is, after he bought them, did the mob still have their fingers in there? Did they still have some involvement, some way of skimming money from these casinos that Hughes owned? I am of two minds on that. I don't have the hard evidence to show that the mob was skimming from Howard Hughes. On the other hand, it's hard to imagine that they weren't.
Now, we've only got a few minutes left, Geoff, but talk us through the final and rather sad ending to this tale of Howard Hughes.
So Howard Hughes left Las Vegas in 1970. He had a falling out with his right-hand man, Bob Mayhew. This was engineered by other executives within his company. That's the Palace Intrigue, part of my book title. And he left Las Vegas. He traveled overseas. He was in London for a period of time. He was in Central America, and he ended up in Mexico. And in each case, he was never really as comfortable as he had been in Los Angeles or Las Vegas. But he just feared lawsuits. He feared being called to testify in court, anything like that. If he was outside the country, he could avoid that. At the same time, what was happening is his physical health and his mental health were getting worse, and he was basically in bed most of the time. In the mid 70s, his doctors, his self-appointed doctors, were not taking good care of him, honestly, and his aides were allowing his problems to fester, his drug addictions, his he had bed sores. I mean, things were not going well, and nobody was really stepping in to do anything about it. This is a story that you hear about with other people too, right? Elvis Presley, Michael Jackson. There's all kinds of these sort of super famous people who in the end just don't have the right people around them to help them out. And I think that's what happened with Howard Hughes. I think he also, had brain injury, possibly from those plane crashes in the 40s and 30s. And there was a lot of lingering physical effects that just turned him into more or less a vegetable. And so when he died, it should not have come as a surprise to the people around him, considering the state he was in.
Final question, Geoff. Why the enduring appeal of Howard Hughes?
I think that people love the entrepreneur. I think they like the Maverick, someone who is sort of going against convention or trying to push things forward. There's all kinds of people in our world history who fit this mold, and I think Howard Hughes is one of those individuals that people admire because he didn't play by the same rules as everyone else. He didn't, and I'm the first guy to say I do this, but I mean he didn't take down a weekly paycheck and want to make sure his health insurance is covered. He didn't care about any of that. He wanted to do something amazing and do something bold, and I think he did it. He did it in a variety of industries, and even though it ended badly, people remember him in a positive way.
Well, you've told his tale very well, Geoff. Tell people where they can find out more about you and where they can also pick up a copy of your book.
My book about Howard Hughes is available on most of the online sites where you can order books, and it's available from University of Nevada Press. So happy to have anybody take a look. It's also an audiobook. And as far as for me, I'm at the Mob Museum here in Las Vegas. Great museum. Anybody comes to visit Las Vegas, they need to stop in here.
Geoff, thank you so much for coming on Things Visible and Invisible.
I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on another episode of Things Visible and Invisible. We're dedicated to uncovering phenomena that challenge our understanding of reality, from ancient enigmas and paranormal encounters to scientific anomalies and forgotten histories. If you enjoyed this journey into the mysterious and unexplained, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell to stay updated on future explorations. Have a personal experience or story that aligns with our investigations? We'd love to hear from you. Visit our website at tvi.show and reach out through our contact form. While we can't feature every submission, we review them all, and your story might be featured in an upcoming episode. To support our continued investigations, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter or channel member. Your contributions make these explorations possible and give you access to exclusive content, early releases, and monthly behind-the-scenes discussions with our team. Don't forget to check out our merch store. We've got everything from TVI branded t-shirts and hoodies to stickers and coffee mugs, perfect for showing your support while keeping the mysteries close. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time as we continue to explore the things visible and invisible.